The desert night was still, but the soldier's heart wasn't. His radio hissed with broken static, his unit silent on the other end. Then, beneath the shifting sand, a sound no training had prepared him for. Something moved where nothing should exist. What happened next was buried in silence, sealed in files the military refuses to acknowledge. The soldier's name was Captain Rafik, leader of a small reconnaissance unit assigned to what the command called a routine patrol. On paper, it was straightforward: sweep a stretch of remote desert, log movement, and report back. But nothing about the region felt routine. For weeks, intelligence reports spoke of strange, seismic activity, brief tremors too irregular to be natural and too faint to warrant scientific interest. The locals had a simpler explanation. They whispered of something old, something buried deep, stirring in its sleep. Command dismissed the talk as superstition, but Rafik knew better than to ignore the silence of a people who had lived in this land for centuries. The desert punished every step they took. The sun was merciless, boiling the horizon in waves of heat. Sand scorched their boots while the air itself seemed to shimmer, bending the world into mirages. Radio chatter was kept minimal, words carried away by the emptiness, swallowed whole by the desert's oppressive stillness. Each man felt it, that the silence was not the peace of an empty land, but the weight of something watching from below. The patrol moved in formation, eyes scanning endless dunes, rifles tight against their shoulders. They were trained to expect ambushes, hostile fire, maybe an IED buried in the sand. But this was different. The stillness itself became the threat, wrapping around them tighter than barbed wire. Even the desert wind refused to stir. Then it came, so faint at first they thought it was exhaustion playing tricks. A shiver beneath their boots, a subtle vibration that rolled through the sand like a slow exhale. The men froze, every sense sharpened. Captain Rafik raised his hand, signaling silence. Another tremor followed, stronger, as if something vast had shifted just below the surface. The desert held its breath. They pressed forward, formation tight, but the desert no longer resembled the lifeless expanse they had trained for. It felt wrong. The sand gave way to stretches of cracked earth, jagged veins splitting the ground into uneven plates. In the distance, the rusting skeletons of abandoned outposts leaned against the horizon. Watchtowers with ladders half collapsed, sand-swept bunkers with doors gaping like broken jaws. Their maps said these facilities were still active, but the truth stood in front of them. They had been deserted long ago. Private Imran tapped his compass, frowning. The needle spun, hesitated, then rotated again as though chasing something unseen. The others checked their gear. Each compass told a different story, none of them useful. Even the radios betrayed them. At first it was only static bleeding into their headsets, but soon the voices of command fractured mid-sentence, words stretching unnaturally, bending into metallic echoes before cutting off completely. It was as though the desert itself refused to let their signals escape. The men spoke less now. They didn't need to. The silence around them carried its own weight. The usual signs of desert life were missing. No lizards darting between rocks, no hawks tracing the sky, not even the hum of insects. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been erased, and beneath it all, the rumbles persisted, faint, uneven, like something moving through layers of sand. Too slow and too deep for machinery, too purposeful to be an earthquake. Sweat streaked down their faces despite the cooling wind that now pushed across the dunes. For the first time, the desert air felt cold. Captain Rafik ordered a halt, scanning the land ahead. Then they saw it. Just beyond the next ridge, the earth had torn itself open. Fissures cut across the desert floor, stretching deep and wide, the edges jagged as if something enormous had clawed its way up, or was trying to. The soldiers stood at the brink of the fractures, staring down into darkness. The desert no longer felt still. It felt alive. Driven flow. The fissures gaped open like scars across the desert floor. But before the men could decide whether to push forward or retreat, the unthinkable happened. One moment Private Salim was there, brushing sand off his rifle, muttering about the compass, his boots planted firmly on solid ground. The next moment, he was gone. No cry, no sound of struggle, No displaced sand. Just gone, as if the earth had swallowed him whole without warning. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The unit stood frozen, staring at the empty space where he had been standing seconds earlier. Then the panic came, sharp and unrestrained. Two soldiers dropped to their knees, clawing at the sand, certain he had slipped into a hidden sinkhole. Another shouted his name into the fissures, the echoes trailing back in warped tones that didn't sound human. Captain Rafik barked at them to hold formation, but his own voice trembled under the strain. They tried to rationalize it. Heat stroke, disorientation, maybe Salim had wandered when no one was looking. But the truth was brutal in its simplicity. He had vanished in plain sight. One blink, and he was gone. The desert responded with its own cruelty. Clouds thickened unnaturally across the horizon, swallowing the sun faster than it had any right to set. Shadows stretched long and warped, as though the light itself was bending under some unseen force. A sudden gust of wind howled across the dunes, carrying with it a sound that froze the blood in their veins. It wasn't the shifting of sand or the whine of the wind through fissures. It was dragging, heavy, deliberate beneath the ground, like stone grinding against stone. Radios crackled alive. A soldier pressed his headset, relief flashing across his face as command finally came through. But the words were cut with static, the voice breaking apart mid-transmission. Then, sharp and urgent, came the final half sentence before the channel died again. "You're not alone out?" The line went dead, leaving only the hiss of static and the pounding of their own hearts. The desert floor trembled again, this time strong enough that every man felt it through the soles of his boots. The vibration wasn't like an earthquake, not a violent shake, but a steady, living pulse that rose from beneath the sand. Helmets rattled, rifles quivered against trembling palms, and for the first time no one dared pretend this was natural. "Enemy tunnels," someone muttered, half convincing himself. The theory spread quickly, an insurgent network buried deep under the desert, maybe even collapsing under its own weight. Desperation became action. Weapons leveled toward the fissures, and with a shouted command, the silence shattered in a hail of gunfire. Bullets ripped into the open cracks, sparks flashing as ricochets danced across stone. Sand exploded upward in violent plumes, and the smell of hot metal filled the air. But the ground responded, not with cries of wounded enemies, but with movement. Entire stretches of desert shifted like water struck by a stone. The earth collapsed in sections, dunes sinking, reforming, swallowing their own shape. Shadows rippled beneath the surface, massive and fluid, traveling faster than any man could run. Panic fractured discipline. Some soldiers fired wildly, others backed away, boots slipping in loose sand. One froze, pointing with a trembling hand as his voice cracked. "Something's down there. Something enormous." His words came out like a confession, not a report. The tremors grew stronger. Loose equipment rattled against their packs. A fissure widened suddenly, splitting the formation in two, forcing the captain to drag men back from the collapsing edge. The desert no longer felt solid. It felt alive, unstable, as though the unit had stumbled onto the surface of something ancient and breathing. Then came the voice, not shouted, not human, a whisper, thin, chilling, and threaded through the static of every radio at once. "You're not supposed to be here." The desert fell silent again. Only the rasp of labored breathing and the oppressive weight of those words remained. The men stared at one another, each realizing the same truth. Whatever was beneath them knew they were here, and did not want them to leave. The captain's voice cracked through the comms, sharp and urgent. "Requesting immediate extraction. Coordinates transmitted. Repeat requesting extraction." Static hissed. Then a cold response slid through the speakers. "Negative. You're off grid. No support available." For a moment, no one moved. The desert stretched silent and infinite around them, but the weight of that denial hit harder than any gunfire. The men looked at each other, expressions tight, eyes wide, trying to decide if they had just been abandoned or if something worse had intervened. Arguments erupted. One sergeant insisted they push deeper, find high ground, re-establish a signal. Another snapped back that retreat was their only chance. "We don't even know where back is anymore," someone muttered, pointing at the horizon. The landmarks they had marked on entry, rock formations, distant dunes, were gone. In every direction, the landscape seemed rearranged, like a chessboard reset in silence. Maps came out, compasses checked. Needles spun aimlessly, refusing to settle. A grid that once seemed reliable now mocked them with blankness. Even GPS screens blinked error codes, coordinates vanishing into empty fields of data. The desert was erasing itself around them, piece by piece, as though the land refused to let them remember the way. Fear festered quickly. Men argued, shouted, fell silent again, aware that raising their voices made them sound smaller against the endless night. Their boots crunched nervously against sand that seemed thinner, looser, less stable than before. Every step felt like walking on the surface of a drum, hollow beneath their weight. Then it happened. A single soldier, positioned near the rear, staggered. His shout cut through the argument, raw and panicked. The ground beneath him sank like wet fabric, collapsing in an instant. Sand swallowed his legs, then his chest, dragging him down with terrifying speed. Hands lunged to grab him, rifles and straps used as lifelines, but the desert was faster. His scream ended abruptly as the sand sealed shut, leaving only silence and the wide-eyed faces of the men who had failed to hold him. The ground gave no trace of him, no gear, no sound, no mark, just untouched desert. The survivors moved like phantoms, their boots dragging across terrain that no longer felt like earth. Hours of wandering brought them to its edge, a massive crater, yawning wide against the horizon, its rim fractured and trembling. The pit was not still. Sand shifted in restless waves within it, as though something vast stirred just beneath the surface. Every gust of wind carried with it a hollow, resonant hum, like the earth itself exhaling. The men froze, staring into the abyss. Their training told them to secure high ground, establish a perimeter, hold until dawn. But this was no battlefield. This was a wound in the world, raw and alive. Still, instinct clung to them like ritual. They fortified positions along the jagged lip, rifles leveled toward the shifting pit, eyes flicking toward shadows that seemed to dance without light. As night fell, desperation seeped in. Ammunition counted in whispers, rations reduced to nothing. One canteen passed between three men, dry lips cracking against the metal. Supplies were gone, but so was hope. Their radios spat only distortion, voices warped into meaningless murmurs. The stars above blurred as if the sky itself recoiled from what lay beneath. The protagonist pulled the recorder from his vest, hands trembling. He spoke low, voice frayed but steady. "If anyone finds this, don't follow the sound." The words hung in the stale air, a warning carved from fear itself. Then came the rumble, faint at first, like a distant storm. But it grew. The crater groaned, sand spilling inward in rivers. The ground beneath their boots shivered, pulsing as though a heartbeat throbbed in the earth below. Men braced, weapons ready, though none could say what they were preparing to face. The desert exhaled again, louder now, deep enough to rattle bones. The ground split, fissures webbing outward like lightning frozen in stone. And then, silence. A stillness so complete it crushed their breath. The protagonist's hand tightened on his rifle, eyes wide when the earth convulsed beneath them in a violent quake that sent the world collapsing inward. Days later, when the rescue team finally broke through the static choked silence of the desert, they expected carnage. Bodies, shell casings, the familiar wreckage of men lost to war. Instead, they found only absence. The crater was there, vast and still trembling faintly, but the soldiers were not. What remained was a ring of scorched sand, blackened as if licked by fire, and rifles broken clean in half, scattered like offerings around the rim. At first, the silence seemed like a mercy. No struggle, no gore, just emptiness. But emptiness itself was a kind of terror. The rescue team combed the area, voices hushed as though afraid to wake something. Finally, they stumbled across a lone survivor, slumped against a dune miles from the crater. His uniform hung in tatters, eyes vacant and glassy. When he spoke, his words were fragmented, barely strung together. "It moves under us." It listens. It waits. He could not explain how he had escaped, nor why he alone remained. Every question brought the same trembling whisper. It's still there. Back at the forward base, technicians recovered the unit's black box recorder, half buried in the sand. When they played it, the room fell still. At first, only static. Then beneath it came frequencies no one could identify. Low, resonant pulses layered with grinding tones, like stone dragged across stone. The sound rose and fell in strange rhythmic patterns, not seismic, not mechanical, but alive. Some swore it resembled a heartbeat. Others refused to listen a second time. Within hours, the area was sealed. Military survey maps were redrawn, landmarks erased, official channels declaring the patrol lost to hostile environmental conditions. The survivor was transferred to a facility whose name did not appear on any roster. The files marked classified, but outside the fences, the desert does not forget. Seismic monitors, civilian and independent, still register anomalies in that same quadrant. Strange tremors without epicenters, sounds that rise and vanish without explanation. And the most unsettling part, the frequencies recorded since then match exactly with the last transmissions of the Lost Patrol. The ground is still moving. What unfolded in that desert cannot be explained by a single theory. Some suggest it was psychological warfare, an experiment designed to test the breaking point of men under isolation and fear. Others whisper of subterranean weapons, frequencies engineered to disorient, to erase direction and reason. And then, of course, there are those who believe it was something far older than war or science, something buried beneath the sands long before soldiers ever set foot there. But beyond the speculation lies the truth of human experience. A handful of men placed in the path of forces they could neither predict nor control. Their courage was not in firing their weapons or holding their ground, but in enduring the unknown, the silence, the whispers, the shifting earth beneath their boots. It is easy to be brave against what you can see. It is another thing entirely to face what hides in the unseen. There is a price to silence too. When authorities choose secrecy over honesty, the cost falls on the shoulders of those who live the nightmare and those who never return. The mission reminds us that war is not the only battlefield. Sometimes the enemy is uncertainty itself. And in that desert, the soldiers discovered that not every fight ends with victory or defeat. Some simply vanish into silence. What do you think really happened out there? Was it a weapon buried in secrecy, an ancient force stirring beneath the sand, or simply the desert itself twisting perception until men could no longer tell what was real? The records are sealed, the maps erased, and yet the ground in that region still trembles as if remembering. These soldiers left behind fragments, words cut short, weapons half buried, whispers on the radio, but no answers. The truth may never be spoken aloud, but maybe, just maybe, it's still moving underground,